Reading Corner today, I'm pleased to be welcoming back Kate DiCamillo. We're going to be talking about her latest published novel, The Beatryce Prophecy. Just to give listeners a little bit of a flavour, here's an excerpt from the beginning of the novel. It is written in the chronicles of sorrowing that one day there will come a child who will unseat a king. The prophecy states that this child will be a girl, and because of this, the prophecy has long been ignored. The Beatryce Prophecy is set in a world reminiscent of medieval Europe. It's the story of a young girl who can read and write, even though it's forbidden for girls to read and write, and only powerful men have the privilege of literacy. At the start of the story, Beatryce is discovered by a monk. She is bruised, bloodied, crying, and shielded by the monastery's goat. Where has she come from and who is she? It's a mystery. And as the story unfolds, Beatryce sets out on a journey where she will put right or wrong and play a part in building a world where wisdom is valued above baseless power. So, Kate, is that a reasonable summary of the book to get us going?
Two things were going through my head as I was listening to you. And the first one had absolutely nothing to do with me. It was rather, oh boy, I want to read that book. So thank you for making it sound so good. And the second is, I love that you said it's a world reminiscent of medieval Europe. And so because this is a fairy tale, and it is not historical fiction. And you, the discerning reader, picked up on that. And then there was another thing that made me kind of want to cry in your introduction, which is wisdom over baseless power. I was very moved by all of that.
We'll come back to lots of those points. Fairy tale is one of the themes that I wanted to pick up, but I want to start with beginnings. And actually the story doesn't start with Beatryce, it starts with Answellica, the goat. And the description is, Answellica was a goat with teeth that were the mirror of her soul, large, sharp, and uncompromising. She's clearly one of my favourite characters in this story. And there's a lot to talk about when we think about her. I think I want to start with where she actually came from, if indeed you can remember.
Yeah, no, I don't remember it. If I can give a longer answer about the story in general, what happened was I started this. My mother had passed away in 2009. I started it in the summer of that year, and I got just like maybe 40 pages in a second draft, and then I forgot about it. I found it 8 years later when I was cleaning out of the closet in my office. And it had been so long since I'd seen it that I could look at it like something that had nothing to do with me. And I saw that it was a story that needed to be told. And all I know is when I sat down to write it, I've gone back through all my notebooks when I started writing it, that goat was there from the very beginning, but also Answellica is one of those characters who you wait and dream of when you're a writer. And then you spend a whole long period hoping that this character doesn't take over the whole book because she's so strong, so domineering, and kind of lovable, And so it was just like, but I knew it was Beatryce's story. So it was always kind of like this wrestling between Beatryce and Answellica.
Interesting. A question that I'm sure you have been asked many times before, but there is a bond between child and goat. And in a lot of your stories, there is this bond between an animal and a child who's in some form of crisis. It's often a dislocation from a parent, not necessarily a parent who isn't there, but there's definitely a dislocation of some kind, as indeed there is in this story, even though it's not a terrible relationship. She's searching for her mother. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Is that something that you notice in your own work?
I do notice it to the point where I have to not notice it, or else because it's such writing is kind of instinctual for me. And it's that thing where I'm kind of writing behind my own back. And because this bond has showed up, Ramona, the dog, speaking of dogs, and animals, it's almost something that I have to not pay attention to, because it's something that the 8-year-old in me is part of telling these stories and getting to that part that is looking for the missing parent, because that was the case with me. And I was really sick a lot as a kid, and I grew up with a standard poodle named Nanette, and I spent a lot of time on the bathroom floor with fevers, and Nanette would always come and sit right beside me. And it's funny because I've talked so much about how animals show up in the stories, but it isn't until talking about this book that I go all the way back to Nanette and think, okay, that's central to a lot of what I'm doing, is just that comfort of and loyalty of an animal and that bond. She and I were up 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning on the bathroom floor. And my mother always used to say she must have been a nurse in a previous life. And when I think about it, that's the second illustration that Sophie does in the book with Beatryce, and Answalika together. Like, that would have been very much like Nanette and I on the bathroom floor.
I don't know whether you've been asked this before. I rather imagine you have, but does faith play into your writing?
The act of writing for me is, at the risk of sounding grandiose, it's a spiritual undertaking. And telling a story is a way to connect with something much larger than I am and smarter than I am. And so it feels like an act of faith to do it. And it feels like a way to get to the best part in me, and also the best part of other people, and to find faith and hope and love there in a subterranean way. Does that make sense? It's all there, and I go down digging as my best self and find these things that are there, and that we forget about. Does that make sense?
It does. I wanted to ask you something really specific. I said I might ask things that are completely off beam, and that's to do with the kind of symbolism around, the religious symbolism around goats. It's a really interesting one. I think in Matthew, where, people are divided into sheep or goats, and there's about standing on the left-hand side and the right-hand side of God. And then when we come to the end of the book, and you've got Jack Dory on one side and the goat is actually on the right. Now, this is probably completely madness, but I was just intrigued.
It's really interesting, though, because it goes exactly to what I was just saying, that thing of tapping into knowledge that I don't know that I even have, because I don't know that part of Matthew with the sheep and goats, but yet there is something wiser and much more profound that is available to me through the telling of the story. And it also goes to writing behind my own back. So it's funny because a couple months ago, I had a dream where Answalika had a St. Lucy crown on her head, and, the crown of candles. And it was just such a great dream. And I said to Sophie Blackall, can you draw that for me? And she did. And so, there's all this stuff that is under there that is smarter than I am. And I'm working with something that is better than I am.
Sort of channeling in a way.
Yes. There's a wonderful book by the writer George Saunders called A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, about writing. And he teaches, it's kind of a master class that he gives to his students, but he does it through Russian short stories. And he talks so much about this, and quotes Milan Kundera, that if the novel isn't smarter than the writer, then the writer isn't doing a very good job. And so that's kind of how I feel. It's my best self. And I can't imagine not getting to do this work.
You mentioned dreaming there. And of course, dreaming is an important part of this story too. And I found that dream of the seahorse with the one eye and the falling, which is sort of patterned through this story, each time incrementally giving us a little bit more. Really compelling. Did you see that as an image? I mean, how did that come about?
That image, in the intervening years when I forgot about this novel, every once in a while that seahorse would go through my brain. And this is what I would think. I would think, what is that from? Where did I read that? And it was just that image is the one that over the 8 years that the novel was there and waiting was the one that I would come back to. And I didn't even know that it was something that I had written. And then when I wrote a speech when I did all the promotional stuff over here, and I talked about remembering that seahorse occasionally, the thing that's at the back of your brain, the hippocampus, is Latin for seahorse.
That's amazing, isn't it? It's actually, I believe it's shaped like a seahorse. That's how it gets its name.
Yeah, I feel like every book is a gift, but this one and Edward Tulane, it's like I realize they're a gift. And I feel like, I say to my friends, I feel kind of like a furry-footed hobbit carrying something really precious in a goblet that I can't drop it. And that's what my job is to try to not drop the story.
So thinking about some of the things that are contained within that precious story then, Beatryce is urged by the monk brother Edic, when he finds who she is, this girl who can read and write but shouldn't be allowed to. He says it's very dangerous for you to be who you are, and so you must pretend to be someone you're not. Throughout this story, Beatryce is being urged to be invisible and to be mute, and yet she's constantly asserting who she is. Even her name, to be, Beatryce, to be.
Wow, I'd never put that together. Right. And, and just as you were saying that about how, yes, she's told that, but yet she constantly asserts herself, and she's got the goat at her side as a reminder to be herself. And so much of Ansuelica to me is like, I was aware of this, and I wonder if you read it this way. It's so much about the transforming power of love. The monks didn't know how to get rid of her. They're terrified of her. And then she recognizes and loves Beatryce, and that's it. She is in her best self, transformed by love.
And other characters are seeking that love in this story too. I mean, Brother Edic, who we've just mentioned, he's had a loveless family. He's also seeking that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And is also transformed by love. I don't know if it's Brother Edic who thinks it or Beatryce, about how just the fact that that whatever happens, there are people who will come for you no matter what, is everything.
I did mention in the beginning that it was reminiscent of a medieval setting in so many ways. Do you know where that aspect of the story came from, the medievalism? Is it because stories at that time were both spiritual, if you like, the prophecies, but also they were informed very much by fairy tale, the writings of that period? Even the legends and of the saints and so on, there's a kind of crossover.
Right. Yeah. I know I'm going into fairy tale. I'm aware of that when I do it, but the rest seems to be subconscious, but it does free up so many things, and it makes words and stories in illuminated manuscripts just as magical as they truly are, right? Because you clear away everything else and you can see them for what they are, which is, and this story is, when I go back and I can look at it from a distance, this is one of the things that I can see is that I was a kid who knew that I needed stories, and I was lucky enough to get them from my mother, but I was also desperate to learn how to read myself. And I struggled when I got to school. I didn't understand phonics. It made zero sense to me, and I was hysterical. I came home and said to my mother, I don't know what to do. I was weeping. And my mother was very pragmatic, said, for the love of Pete, calm down. And she said, you're smart. That was gift one. Gift two was, we'll figure out how your brain works and we'll work around it. That was gift two. And then gift three was every day after school, a pile of flashcards with a word on them. And I just memorized the words. And that's how I learned how to read. And there's a moment where Beatryce is teaching Jack Dory how to read. And he feels like each letter was a door that led to a lighted room. And that's the way it felt to me when I was sitting there doing those flashcards with my mother.
Amazing.
Yeah.
One way of reading the story could be that it's saying in part that the pen is mightier than the sword. Don't waste your time on revenge, Jack is told at one point in the story. And here, literature and reading are a real threat to authoritarianism. It's very much about giving you an insight into the lives of others so that you can make your own judgments.
Yes. Yeah. And, it makes me cry to think about it. And yes, a way into understanding other people's hearts, which is what we know literature can do, right? It literally teaches us, adults and children, how to be empathetic, how to imagine your way into somebody else's heart. And once you can imagine your way into somebody else's heart, it's a lot harder to hate them or to judge them. You're just more prone to being open and loving in somebody else's life.
I've got a personal question really related to that. It's a quote that the reason literacy is important is that literature is the operating instructions, the best manual we have, the most useful guide to the country we're visiting, life.
That's actually Ursula K. Le Guin. And even to hear it again now and hear you reading it, gosh, I think that is so right. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you whether there's a time that you can consciously remember learning a life lesson from reading, where you know that you've taken a different course of action in life directly as a result of something that you've read.
I can go all the way back to being a kid and reading a book, which I think is out of print, called Somebody Else's Shoes, about a girl whose father was a cobbler, and she would put on other people's shoes, and then she would experience their life, the shoes that had been brought in to be repaired. And there was the popular mean girl at school, and she went and put her shoes on and found out how hard and miserable things were at home. And it changed her. And I remember reading this book over lunch, being out on the playground, and watching the bully chasing somebody through the playground. He bent over, and I saw on his back that there were marks from a strap, somebody, and it all like went together in my head with like, if I put his shoes on, I would find out that this bully is getting beaten at home. And from that moment on, and from that book, I that ability to just think, okay, what if I was in that person's shoes? What would I see? Even at a very young age, I started to do that consciously because of that book.
I was thinking, when I knew I was going to ask you that question, I thought, I can't ask a question unless I can answer it myself.
And can you answer it?
Well, there are many times, but the one that I wanted to mention was much more recent. And it was Jason Reynolds' book, Long Way Down. And I've always known, the cognitive part of my brain has always known that life isn't fair and that some people have to survive in the circumstances in which they are, and that sometimes makes them take different courses of action to the action that you might take yourself. But I think what reading that book did was make me feel it.
Yeah, God. And let's just spend a minute with Jason Reynolds and talk about what a genius he is, and talk about, I always love acknowledgments in books. Okay, I'm loving a book, and then I'll flip to the end and look to see, okay, who helped? And Jason has, in the end of Look Both Ways, the most beautiful acknowledgement. He thanks everybody in the neighborhood that he grew up in. And then he thanks the reader.
Mm.
See, I can't do this without crying. And he says, I like you. That's what he says to the reader. I like you. I love you. Tell me, how are you going to change the world? To me, that it encapsulates every miraculous thing that can happen between writer and reader, and how it can shift our hearts and make us empower us to change the world.
And in your own story, there's a sort of meta storytelling going on, where Beatryce, here we come into the real fairy tale element of it. It's almost like 1001 Arabian Nights, Scheherazade. She's telling the king a story, and he becomes absorbed by that story. He wants to know, tell me how it's going to end.
Yeah. And that, the Scheherazade and that, I have two things to say about that. That was in my conscious mind. I was aware that was going on. It's like, oh, she is literally telling a story to save her life here. And the other thing was how the stories within stories within stories is so appealing to me. And I had to stop myself because within that story that Beatryce tells, there was there's a seahorse, and then the seahorse was going to tell a story. I could see it going on forever. It's just like one box after another opening up before me. And it's like, no, we have to stay on course here. But it's just like, it is so compelling to me. Again, it goes back to Jack Dory and the lighted room. That's what stories feel like to me. And to walk from this lighted room into the next lighted room and into the next one. And each lighted room helps you understand yourself better and helps you understand the person standing next to you better.
I have to ask you about the naming of your characters, because I know Jack Dory is a fish.
Right.
but did he just come to you? He's also called St. Peter's fish.
Oh, see, I did not know that. Yeah, I knew that Jack or John Dory was a fish, but I could not. The names, and I don't know if we've talked about this before, but that's the only part of writing that is easy for me. The names come and I make sure that I always have a notebook nearby for when they arrive. And then I'm loath to change them. So it's just like, okay, Jack Dory, John Dory. No, I cannot do it. It has to stay this way. That is right. But where does Answelica come from? I don't know. It's like, I have no idea, but I feel like they're words with springs in them. And if I push on them the right way, they'll lead into the lighted room.
There's so much more that I want to talk about, but I do want to perhaps go back to the fact that this story is dedicated to your mother. What made this the story that was to be dedicated to your mother?
She's showed up in the acknowledgments before, but this is the first one that's dedicated to her. And it wasn't as I was working that I was aware of it. It wasn't until after I was done that I thought, oh, this is probably so much of where this came from. And, I was aware when my mother was still alive of the gift that she gave me as far as libraries and books and buying me books and paying attention to me as a reader. But this thing of the flashcards and the words and telling me that there was a way around and through that debt, I wish that I had been able to articulate to her when she was alive. And I wasn't even aware of it until I had written this book and looked at all of it and thought, okay, this is for my mother, who was extraordinary.
Because it is also, in a way, a story about coming back to your mother. Beatryce finds her mother at the end of this story.
Which is a beautiful point, because I get to find that gift that she gave me again. It's not that I ever forgot those flashcards, but it's that I never saw it and recognized it for what it was.
Kate, it's a truly beautiful story. It's one that I'm going to be returning to and reading many times, I think. So thank you.
Oh, no, I thank you. And what a wonderful, wonderful conversation. And I'm really grateful for it.
In the Reading Corner is presented by Nikki Gamble and produced by Alison Hughes. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please do leave a review for us. To find out about other projects, including an audience with events and the Exploring Children's Literature Summer School, visit www.exploringchildrensliterature.uk. Join us again soon in the Reading Corner on your favourite podcast platform.